overview of conservation of national parks in formerly colonized African countries, but with particular reference to Zimbabwe. Then I would also talk about the implications of nature-culture dichotomy in the conservation of three particular national parks in Zimbabwe. Before I conclude, I will highlight some efforts or the necessity of reclaiming cultural heritage within these national parks. So in Africa and beyond, national parks are home to cultural heritage sites that spans the entirety of human history, from the Stone Age to modern historic times. I am a trained archaeologist with a keen interest in archaeological and cultural heritage elements concealed within national parks and other nature-based protected areas. This interest arises from significant gap in research and literature concerning archaeological and cultural heritage sites within national parks, particularly in Zimbabwe and other African countries, as well as globally. The current body of knowledge in this field is geographically and thematically uneven. For example, in 1999, John Jameson, a now retired archaeologist for the US National Park Service, organized a symposium during the 4th World Archaeology Congress that was held in South Africa. And the title of the symposium was Archaeology and the National Park Idea, Challenges for Management and Interpretation. And this symposium had 5 papers from 4 countries, and it led to the special issue of the George Wright Forum. And these papers examined the unique challenges of managing and interpreting archaeological sites that are located within national parks and other protected areas. Another example is reflected by the Journal of Community Archaeology and Heritage, which celebrated the centennial of the National Park Service of the United States of America between 2015 and 2017 through a series of articles that focused on community and public archaeology in national parks. Notably, these cases were exclusively drawn from American national parks. Recently, the CODE, which is African Protected Conservation and Science, an open access journal of the South African national parks that has been in existence since 1958, published a special issue with the title, Celebrating Cultural Heritage Within National Parks. And this special issue also tried to explore the unique challenges and opportunities associated with preserving and managing cultural heritage within South African national parks. Recently, in 2023, I presented a paper at a symposium in Zimbabwe that highlighted the unique practical challenges of conserving archaeological sites within Hwange, the oldest and the largest national park in the country. My talk highlighted the poor state of conservation of archaeological sites and the threats emanating from wildlife such as elephants, buffaloes, baboons, and other wildlife. After my presentation, several thought-provoking questions were raised, which include one about how to address this situation when one form of heritage, in this case wildlife, is destroying the other, the archaeological sites. Which heritage is supposed to be saved? Who decides? How should communities deal with the loss of their heritage? Such questions and other related conversations have further sparked my interest in exploring the nature-culture dichotomy or tensions in the conservation of heritage of a national park. In this talk, I aim to demonstrate that the heritage and conservation of a national park should not be confined to wildlife, but should aim to integrate a wide range of material and immaterial repositories of history, culture, and heritage belonging to communities displaced by parks establishment. The concept of a national park, which first emerged in the late 19th century in the global north, has evolved into a global phenomenon. While the origins of the national park concept remain a subject of debate, the Yellowstone National Park, established in the United States in 1872, is frequently recognized as the first. This American model has influenced similar initiatives worldwide, including in Africa. In Africa, the current 54 sovereign countries have at least one or more national parks, which results to over 99 of them, most of which were established during the colonial era. While colonial national parks have been maintained, new ones continue to be created in former colonized countries. One inherent problem in the establishment of national parks was and continued to be the displacement of indigenous people from their ancestral lands, often justified in the name of conservation. These forced removals of indigenous people disrupted the connection between culture and nature. Since their inception, the conservation of national parks has primarily focused on wilderness and wildlife, often overlooking physical, cultural, and spiritual attributes associated with these areas. The inherited nature-culture dichotomy from the colonial period has relegated cultural resources to a secondary status within the broader African conservation discourse and practice, resulting in limited efforts to manage both resources simultaneously where they coexist. Zimbabwe has a long colonial history regarding the concept and practice of the national park system dating as early as 1900. Currently, the country has 10 national parks designated primarily as nature territories, focusing on wilderness and wildlife. This emphasis seen not only in Zimbabwean national parks, but also in similar establishment elsewhere, has marginalized the cultural heritage significance of these protected areas. The cultural heritage associated with national parks has often been overlooked, neglected, and inadequately conserved across various geographical regions. This neglect is particularly striking given the fact that the landscapes transformed into national parks are rich with material and immaterial repositories of history, culture, and heritage from communities that were forcibly, violently displaced during the establishment of these protected areas. So the conservation of national parks in Zimbabwe and other African countries is still influenced by the colonially inherited practices of privileging conservation of nature over cultural heritage. Often, archaeological and other cultural heritage sites within national parks remain unprotected from wildlife, suffer from poor conservation, and are difficult to access physically and intellectually. Even when cultural heritage is included in conservation frameworks, it tends to receive less scholarly attention, funding, and research priority. The conservation and management of national parks in many African countries continue to be hounded by colonial legacies that imposed nature-culture administrative binaries, resulting in a problematic separation of nature and culture through legal, institutional, and administrative frameworks. In most African countries, the legal, institutional, and administrative frameworks for managing heritage are divided along nature-culture binaries. In the Zimbabwean context, the conservation of flora and fauna is the statutory mandate of the Parks and Wildlife Management Authority, while the preservation and management of cultural heritage within and beyond the national parks is the responsibility of the national museums and monuments of Zimbabwe. This colonial institutional arrangement has created technical, administrative, and other operational challenges that have negatively affected the sustainable conservation of heritage. Here, I will use examples of just 3 purposively selected national parks to highlight the implications of the long-standing conflicts and contestations between these 2 departments that falls under different line ministries. I will start with Hwange National Park, which was initially created as a game reserve in 1928 and later on proclaimed a national park in 1950. This is the oldest and the largest national park in the country, located in northwestern Zimbabwe. From the colonial era to the present, this national park is promoted in tourism brochures and various platforms as wilderness, an elephant country, or the home of the Big Five. For those who may not be familiar with this concept of the Big Five is a term coined by European hunters in the early 20th century to describe 5 iconic species that were particularly challenging to hunt on foot in Africa. And these are elephants, lions, leopards, buffalo, and rhinoceros. Such emphasis on the Big Five in marketing Hwange National Park obscure the rich human culture and heritage found within this protected area. Concealed within the park and unprotected from wildlife are ancestral graves, homelands, and other cultural heritage belonging to the descendant communities who now live in the margins of this game park. Since the park's establishment, there's been a deliberate effort to create a myth of unpeopled wilderness. For instance, in 1977, the first game warden published a book that was titled Hwange, The Story of a Great Game Reserve. In his book, he cited that anthropology and archaeology were not attracting many researchers, which he deemed understandable. He stated, "The country which now comprises the park does not seem to have been inhabited prehistoric times by men, with the exception of wandering bushmen in more recent times." Contrary to Davison and other people's assertions, my recent fieldworks and many of other archaeologists have identified and recorded more than 100 archaeological sites within Hwange National Park, dating as far as the Stone Age to the later farming communities, also known as the Iron Age period in the Southern African archaeology. These archaeological findings provide compelling evidence that the Hwange National Park and its surrounding has got a deeper and richer history than previously understood. This region, which includes the park, was once a political, social, and economic center of the pre-colonial Nambia state, which thrived between the 13th and 19th centuries. And the descendants of this pre-colonial state are still found in this particular region. The rock art sites, ruins, graves, and other archaeological sites that are concealed within the park are managed under this peculiar dual custodianship, where the park authorities focus on wildlife and nature conservation, whilst the National Museums oversees the cultural heritage. However, as was the case during the colonial era, the organization responsible for cultural heritage management faces financial constraints as well as limited workforce, resulting in insufficient conservation attention for cultural heritage sites within the park and beyond. The effect of wildlife is also worsening the state of conservation of archaeological sites in this particular park. For instance, this park is home to a large population of elephants exceeding its ecological carrying capacity, with estimates ranging between 34,000 to 54,000. As these elephants roam around the park, they often damage walls of ancient dry stone archaeological sites scattered throughout the park. And this destruction is not only coming from elephants, but other animals like buffaloes, baboons also contribute to the degradation of the archaeological sites. Previous efforts to protect archaeological sites through fencing have proven to be inadequate, as noted by the first game ranger, whom I quote here. Fences are foreign to game. The animals just cannot understand the obstacle and will spend days trying to find a way through or around it, through or around it if the barrier happens to be across the chosen path. On the other hand, the descendant communities of the Nambia state have a deep ancestral and cultural connection to the archaeological sites within the Hwange National Park. And over the years, these communities have been consistently advocating for the restoration and conservation of these sites, voicing their concerns through various media and platforms. And in one of my interviews with the local chief, Chief Hwange, and I quote him here, "Those animals are ours. If we ask for 1 or 2 elephants for that restoration project, and if you are saying national museums and monuments has no money for restorations, we have our animals. That should be their use. They can sell them. At times, parks give quotas. They will sell and ensure that the site is restored. If they need labor, we will provide people from my own area, and some will come from Chiefs Shana and Nekatambe." So in many ways, Hwange exemplify a colonially inherited system of selective narrative of a national park's values, one that favors wildlife conservation and tourism pursuits over the cultural history of the land itself. In the next example, I will further present the nature-culture tensions in the conservation and management of Matobo National Park, which is located in southeastern Zimbabwe. And this park was created in 1926 as a bequest of Sisu John Rhodes, and for years became known as Rhodes Matopo National Park. For those who may not be also familiar with the Southern African history, Sisu John Rhodes was a British imperialist and businessman who played a decisive role in the expansion of the British colonial rule in Southern Africa. He was instrumental in the colonization of what is now Zimbabwe, which was at some point renamed Rhodesia in his honor. When he died in 1902, he was buried within Matopo National Park at a place locally known as Malindi Dzimu, which he renamed the World's View. This park is rich in both natural and cultural heritage. Over the years, there have been direct clashes between ideas of heritage and how to preserve it within the park. What emerges from the past and present research and conversations is the fact that the National Parks Authority has over the years conserved Matopo as a uniquely fragile ecosystem which needs to be protected against man and his domestic animals. However, for the local people, the heritage of the park is a question of culture rather than nature. The hills, caves, wildlife, trees in the Matopo are inseparable from their culture and heritage. The conservation and management of Matopo is institutionally divided along the nature-culture dichotomy, where the Parks Authority is responsible for flora and fauna, as well as managing tourist facilities, while the cultural heritage attributes of the park are under the statutory responsibility of National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe. This division has resulted in double ticketing system for tourists interested in both nature and culture. So for example, if you're a tourist wanting to visit Matopo, you must first pay to the Parks Authority. Then if you are interested in visiting the rock art sites and monuments and other cultural heritage sites, you will pay to the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe. And this double ticketing system makes Matopo one of the most expensive parks for tourists who also do not understand why they are required to pay twice to access a single national park. Attempts to address this problem have not been successful, as both government departments have different opinions. In addition to that, these two institutions have been locked in a fight over the control and ownership of the special area in the Victoria Falls National Park. So I now move on to my third example, which is Victoria Falls National Park, located in northwestern Zimbabwe at the border between Zimbabwe and Zambia. And locally, Victoria Falls is known as Mosuya Tunya, which means the smoke that thunders. And it is the largest and most spectacular waterfall in the world. And it was renamed Victoria Falls by David Livingstone, a Scottish missionary and explorer, in honor of the Queen Victoria of England. The falls are divided into various geological zones. The main falls were renamed Rainforest by Edward Moore in 1870 due to its vegetation supported by constant spray of water. And Moore was a German traveler, hunter, explorer, botanist, zoologist, and many other things. And in 1937, the special area in the Victoria Falls was gazetted a national monument, which legally becomes a property that is supposed to be conserved and managed by the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe. In 1952, Victoria Falls was designated a national park, and in 1989, it was inscribed on UNESCO's World Heritage List as a transboundary property co-owned by Zimbabwe and Zambia. On the Zimbabwean side, from colonial era to the present, the control and management of Victoria Falls fall under the Parks Authority. But since the 1970s, there have been contestations because the National Museum has always been wanting to take over the special area, arguing that it's a national monument and it is their responsibility to manage it. But the parks has always been refusing, citing several reasons. For example, the parks has been arguing that the special area is part of nature and their statutory, it is their statutory responsibility for them to manage it. Further on, the Parks Authority assessed that the land where the special area is located is part of a national park, and therefore its administration is their legislative responsibility under the relevant acts. The tensions over the control, conservation, and management of the special area within the Victoria Falls National Park has been ongoing for many years. One instance that I would want to share with you is the event that occurred in 2010. During this year, the National Museums, escorted by the police and led by their chief curator, went to the Victoria Falls special area. They removed the flag of the Parks Authority at the entrance to the rainforest and replaced it with their own. The National Museums was arguing that the newly constructed restaurant within the rainforest violated the laws governing the conservation of World Heritage Sites and was negatively impacting the site's integrity. However, this takeover of the special area that was done in a military style was short-lived, as the Office of the President and Cabinet swiftly made a political decision that reversed the takeover. These three case studies that I've just shared with you highlight how the inherited nature-culture dichotomy from the colonial period has created contestations and tensions on what is worth preserving within the national park. Furthermore, this situation has neglected cultural heritage resources to a secondary status in the conservation of national parks, resulting in limited efforts to manage both resources simultaneously. This necessitates the need to rethink conservation of protected areas in Africa as a process and practice that should care for both natural and cultural heritage attributes of the designated area. Neither category should be privileged over the other, as they are fundamentally inseparable. Some of the issues that I'm presenting emerge from listening to descendant communities whose ancestors were evicted in the creation of national parks. Informed by what Peter Smith and Coy termed the archaeologies of listening, I have spent a considerable amount of time staying, talking, and listening to communities who now live on the margins of the national parks and other protected areas. In their views, the concept of a national park has become dominated by the state authorities, the big non-governmental organizations, bingos, international conservation movements, and international tourism, neglecting their local histories, cultures, and traditions. And for many local communities, as I have just highlighted, the heritage of a national park is a matter of culture rather than nature, because the hills, caves, wildlife, trees within the national parks are deeply intertwined with their history, culture, and heritage. Among the locals, the so-called nature within the park has been shaped over centuries through human use, with its occupation sanctioned by history, religion, and custom. Therefore, the conservation of national parks cannot solely be a nature-centric practice. The nature protected within parks is considered not wild or pristine, but is a product of centuries of human interaction. Prior to colonization, indigenous communities coexisted with wildlife, accumulating profound traditional ecological knowledge about animals, plant species, and other non-human entities. The indigenous communities, they always argue that they've always lived in harmony with nature, viewing ownership of wildlife like other natural resources as a common property governed by strict cultural norms. This inseparability of nature and culture was distorted by colonialism, which imposed Western policies, institutions, and practices of conserving heritage. And within the African worldviews, heritage cannot be neatly divided into binaries of natural, cultural, or tangible and intangible. And in my work, I also find Haraway's concept of nature culture to be very productive in rethinking the conservation of protected areas. As we all know, she argues that nature and culture are deeply intertwined, that they cannot be separated. This notion of nature culture and the theme of this workshop aligns with the African indigenous worldview, where the inseparability of nature and culture is embedded in the concept of heritage. In many African contexts, human society derives meaning from its relationship with wildlife, forests, rocks, caves, pools, songs, beliefs, and practices. Therefore, conservation of protected areas should acknowledge and recognize the indigenous presence, knowledge, and conservation practices. Globally, the efforts to reclaim the parked cultural heritage within national parks are recent, slow, and geographically uneven. Here, I will just share two examples. The first one is the Cultural Anthropology Program established by the National Park Service of the USA in 1981. This program is spearheaded by practicing cultural anthropologists in parks, with some stationed at regional and national offices. The program encompasses a wide range of activities such as research, policy formulation, consultation, and coordination. This program has helped in understanding what is important to communities with special interest in national parks. It has also brought knowledge of contemporary cultural communities to national parks management and enhanced the building of relationships between national parks and communities. Another example, which is also closer to my country, is the South African national parks. Soon after the fall of the apartheid regime in South Africa, there's been an increasing interest in cultural heritage within national parks. The conservation of cultural heritage was initially the responsibility of the social ecology unit within the sun parks, later on transformed into people and conservation department. Currently, the responsibility of looking after cultural heritage is under the cultural heritage unit under the conservation services division. This unit, although it remains short-staffed, has been very active in cultural resources management and promotion of indigenous knowledge associated with national parks in South Africa. And I've already mentioned the special issue that the South African National Parks Authority published just last year, where the theme was celebrating cultural heritage within the national parks. Besides these two examples, and there could be more, efforts to conserve and manage cultural heritage within national parks elsewhere are not well planned, coordinated, and implemented as they can be when it comes to nature conservation. This is reflected in budget allocation or provision of human resources, among other conservation efforts. This prevailing situation in many African national parks and even beyond is a call for rethinking of conservation of these protected areas. As I sum up my talk, the conservation of national parks is a process and practice that has historically prioritized wildlife over other forms of heritage on a global scale. In Africa, particularly in Zimbabwe and other Southern African countries, there is a notable lack of research and literature on the conservation of archaeological heritage sites within national parks. Existing scholarship is largely focused on human-park relations or interactions, human-wildlife conflicts, and more recently, the success or failures of community-based natural resources management that were introduced in many African national parks since the 1980s. As a result, the local concerns and the knowledge regarding what is deemed worthy of preserving and conserving within these protected areas remains on the margin. I want to conclude by saying the heritage of a national park extends beyond wildlife. It encompasses a range of material and immaterial repositories of history, culture, and heritage belonging to communities displaced by the park's authorities. Thank you very much.
So, Nirazi, thank you very much for this very well done presentation about dichotomy between nature and culture inherited from the colonial past and the difficulty to bring it together, but also the importance to integrate the local community, also the displaced communities. So do you have question about the talk?
Thank you first. In one of your slides, there's this notion of archaeologies of listening. Can you elaborate a little further on that? Because, yes, this one. Can you give more information on this practice? Thank you.
Yeah, so the archaeologies of listening is a recent sort of concept that has been recently in the public domain as one of the methods of trying to decolonize archaeology, in particularly the formerly colonized areas, where this discipline has always marginalized the local knowledges with regards to sites and objects. So by archaeologists of listening, the emphasis is that when archaeologists are going out or they are developing their research questions, it is very important to first and foremost co-create or co-think with indigenous communities because this kind of process of listening to them opens a lot of possibilities that enhance our knowledge of the past. And it's a concept that is being popularized by Peter Smith. He's originally from America, but he has worked quite a lot in Tanzania, Uganda, and other African countries. And they have actually published a book titled The Archaeologies of Listening, which is quite a very productive methodological way of also trying to decolonize the practice of archaeology. Yeah. So in my case, I used it as a methodology.
We have some few minutes for another questions or two.
Thank you for a great talk, Munya. You mentioned at various points about the fact that Zimbabwean national parks had inherited colonial kind of legislation and legal frameworks, and also these kind of concepts of nature and culture. I just wanted to ask, what's the role of the Zimbabwean state today in kind of reforming those legislations and trying to, a bit like we were thinking about with Rodney Harrison yesterday, trying to embed this kind of more nature culture approach within legal frameworks?
Yeah, thank you very much for that important question, which I'm also grappling with. What I would say is that it looks like there is no political will to seriously open up dialogue or conversation in terms of how to decolonize approaches to heritage in general, in the broader sense, because, for instance, the legislation that Zimbabwe is still using to manage museums and other cultural heritage resources is still a legislation, a colonial legislation enacted in 1972, and we attained our independence in 1980. But between 1980 and today, the government has managed to come up with new various legislations and policies addressing other issues. So for me, I think it boils down to the political will, policymakers, but also it also comes to the general public, how the relationship between the public, the government, and the politicians. So from my own experience, I think it's a more of a concern among practitioners and scholars who are immediately connected to these issues. But to the politicians, I think it's an issue that they play around with it, where they want to play with heritage, they can manipulate and do whatever they want. But in certain circumstances, for example, when it comes to legislation law, they are not interested. And it's an irony for our country because the name Zimbabwe is actually derived from an archaeological site. We are one of the few countries that are named after an archaeological site. And wherever there are these national celebrations, festivals, we always talk of Great Zimbabwe and so on. But we are so behind legislatively and in other ways of caring for the same heritage. Yeah.
And the last question.
I'm curious. The
Yeah, thank you very much for that important question. So these are indigenous communities that I've been working with. They are part of the minority groups in Zimbabwe. And one interest for them is they are always trying to also project themselves as an important indigenous ethnic group in Zimbabwe. So they also resort to heritage as a way of trying to assert their past and their ethnicity, their belonging. So this is one of the motive why they are also very much interested in the archaeology that is now in the park. And yes, colonialism and other forms of domination has greatly affected their cultural practices and so on. But they are still trying to preserve, even engaging the parks for permission to carry out their rituals and ceremonies, though it is very technically difficult. And also the other disruption is coming from politics, because most of the traditional leaders are now also politically contaminated. They are mainly used by the political elites for certain political agendas, which then affect them from being impactful when it comes to cultural issues. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, all good. Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you, everybody, for such a stimulating couple of days. Before I start, I just wanted to let you know that today is actually my birthday. So, please go easy on me in the Q&A. All right. Terrific. Okay. So, in this paper, I consider Agbogbloshie a scrapyard and electrical and electronic waste processing zone in Accra, Ghana, at the intersection of 3 conservation areas: nature conservation, urban heritage conservation, and new media conservation. Often referred to as Sodom and Gomorrah, Agbogbloshie is associated with highly toxic e-waste recycling practices in which workers attempt to extract precious and semi-precious metals, namely copper, gold, and aluminium, from discarded e-waste. The emission of toxic fumes and chemical leachates from e-waste recycling has polluted local air, water, and soil supplies, which have, in turn, been linked with respiratory diseases, cancers, and genetic deformations in humans and animals. In July 2021, following over a decade of intense media scrutiny, academic research, and failed green interventions, Agbogbloshie was demolished in a violent police and military-backed operation, destroying the homes and businesses of thousands of scrap workers. As you can see on the map here, Agbogbloshie is located on the banks of the Korli Lagoon, along the Odor River, which runs through Accra into the Gulf of Guinea. The Korli Lagoon is a significant hydrological feature of Accra that has been at the center of environment and public health anxieties since the colonial period. It also plays a significant role in the cosmology of the indigenous Ga, a group that has, since the appointment of Accra as the colonial capital of the Gold Coast in 1877, resisted attempts to reshape the city along the lines of an expatriate capitalism that prioritizes colonial goals, namely the imposition of European urban planning and sanitation principles, the formalization of the informal economy, and the lubrication of commodity exports and inward foreign investment. Some of the questions that we have explored over the past 3 days include: who is an expert? Who decides when and how conservation occurs? How do we deal with change? In this paper, I deal with each of these questions, although the final question, which presumes a universal we, a unified subject that equally experiences the effects of climate change and pollution, is one that I want to trouble in favor of a site-specific approach that emphasizes the long and complex land history of Agbogbloshie and the Corley Lagoon. I also want to pose several related questions which come from my own research context, including who or what should be prioritized as the object of conservation in environmental crisis zones like Agbogbloshie? Why, if e-waste pollution posed significant ecological and public health risks, might it have been responsible to conserve Agbogbloshie scrapyard? How, in toxic and precarious informal settlements where public and environmental health concerns rub up against the economic needs of informal workers, can harm be reduced and care provided for both human and more than human life? First, I want to briefly describe how e-waste ends up at Agbogbloshie and the processes of toxification and material transformation that take place there. Most commonly, e-waste is shipped to Ghana by sea aboard standard 20 to 40 foot shipping containers sent to Tema Harbour, which is Ghana's largest port, often via Rotterdam or Antwerp. There's also increasing evidence to suggest that e-waste flows are interregional, arriving both by ship and over land from neighbouring African countries, such as Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and Egypt. These containers can hold 30 tons of used electrical and electronic equipment at maximum capacity, and uncorroborated industry sources claim that up to 600 containers arrive in Ghana each month. The electrical and electronic equipment that arrives in Ghana on these containers varies significantly in age, usability, condition, quality, function, and value. Traders in Ghana pay up to $5,000 for a container of e-waste to repair, reuse, and resell. The main e-waste being processed at Agbogbloshie are obsolete computers, televisions, and plastic-coated wires. Other e-wastes processed here include white goods, such as refrigerators, microwaves, and washing machines. The most valuable and easily repairable equipment is taken to small workshop locations, restored to usable condition, refurbished, resold, and reused. Equipment that cannot be repaired is disassembled using tools such as hammers, screwdrivers, and chisels to recover components. The most valuable components, such as motherboards, printed circuit boards, and microchips, are sold to repair shops, and less immediately valuable materials, such as plastic-coated wires, are taken to the edge of the scrap metals market and designated for burning. Materials of little to no economic value are discarded in the general disposal area or used to stoke open-pit fires. So we have an image of open pit burning here, which I'm going to address in more detail in a moment, but I'm just going to describe the actual process itself. Open pit burning is commonly used to extract copper from wires and cables, which involves the melting away of the wire's plastic coating to get at the metals contained within. The primary fuel source for open pit fires is insulating foam from obsolete refrigerators, which emit ozone-depleting chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere. The polluting impact of copper wire open pit burning has been attributed to high concentrations of polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, insulation in wires' plastic coating. PVC is not combustible and must be heated at around 400 degrees Celsius to ignite. The open pit burning process cannot achieve temperatures this high, which leads to an incomplete combustion reaction and the emission of hydrogen chloride gas through smoke. Pollution is also caused by the buildup of toxic ash at the site of open fires. New fires are continuously relit on the site of old fires, leading to an accumulation of ash and partially burned materials, which are directly discharged into the soil. During periods of high rainfall, this ash is then transported to the lagoon area, causing a buildup of chemical leachates in drinking water and in crops. This photograph by Niaba Leon Udriago taken in 2008 as part of his series The Hell of Copper, documents the process of open pit burning. Here, a waste worker named Yao stands over an open pit fire. Yao is dressed in an ash-stained vest and charred denim cutoffs. At the center of the image is a bundle of wires ablaze inside a hollowed-out desktop screen. A thick plume of smoke emanates from the fire, filling the frame. The ground about the fire is almost black from continuous burning. At Yao's feet, there is a small yield of copper scrap. This copper scrap will be sold to a middleman trader who in turn will sell it to a formal recycling firm or a refinery in the nearby Tema export zone. Eventually, these recycled metals will find their way back into the supply chain, most often in Asian manufacturing economies, particularly China, for use in the production of new electronic equipment. We can think of the material transformations documented in this image in a few different ways. The first and perhaps most obvious agent of material transformation is the fire that burns the plastic coating, emitting pollutants into the air and revealing the copper. The polluted air is then breathed in by workers and the local population, toxifying their bodies with harmful contaminants. At the same time, there is a sense in which e-waste burning is an environmental good. Through this process, workers extend the lifespan of metals and reduce the need for energy-intensive and equally polluting processes of primary extraction through deep shaft and open pit mining. Indeed, the environmental cost of these practices in terms of carbon emissions is much smaller than the emissions produced through the industrial scale processes of extraction, refining, and shipping that underpin the primary extraction of mineral resources. And so, if it were possible to mitigate the toxic risks of informal e-waste burning, these practices could be seen as a form of environmental conservation rather than degradation. We might also think of e-waste burning as a form of physical material reclamation in the sense that is explored by Sylvia Winter and more recently Catherine Yusoff through her analysis of the Black Anthropocene. Africa, specifically the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, and Namibia, are significant sites for copper extraction. Once extracted from the ground, this copper is traded and shipped as a commodity, used in the production of consumer objects, and eventually returned to the African continent as toxic waste. In this way, it might be tempting to understand e-waste burning as a tragic neo-colonial conclusion to a long history of metal extraction, craft, and trade, evoking and perhaps standing in contrast to the highly skilled production of bronze sculptures in various parts of the continent, and most famously in Benin. In the Ghanaian context, we might also think of Akan gold weights made of bronze, which, much like the copper shown in this photograph, were used to facilitate the exchange of gold, cowrie shells, and enslaved persons, producing the historic trade imbalances that enabled what Walter Rodney called the underdevelopment of Africa. This is to say nothing of the geological and mineralogical supports of digital photography itself. As explored by Siobhan Angus in her recent volume, Camera Geologica, both the camera and the digital infrastructure required to capture, distribute, and consume images such as this are predicated on the massive extraction of mineral resources and the production of electrical and electronic equipment. Indeed, the very recognition of what Udriago refers to as a hell requires participating in its making in some way. However, perhaps these more speculative associations are less immediately significant than the monies that e-waste burning provides workers. Like most other workers at Agbogbloshy, Yao is a Dagomba migrant from northern Ghana. Owing to underemployment and a shrinking agriculture sector in the north, many Dagomba are forced into e-waste labor to secure their and their family's subsistence. Often, workers use the money earned from e-waste burning to fund agricultural ventures in their hometowns and villages. From this image alone, then, one gets a sense of the complex material entanglements and moral ethical dilemmas that emerge from Agbogbloshy. a place where workers experience and embody the antinomies of nature and culture, waste and value, toxicity and sustainability, conservation and reclamation, and lives and livelihoods every day. Foregrounding experiences of harm through photography without overrepresenting, objectifying, and commodifying those experiences is a challenge. Consider South African photographer Peter Hugo's portrait of teenage waste worker Abdullah Yahya. Placing the camera close to the subject and low to the ground, Hugo collapses the perceived distance between the spectator and Yahya. Yahya's outward-looking gaze meets the gaze of the spectator. The photograph asks the spectator not only to apprehend Yahya in his apprehending them, but to recognize their complicity with the scene of smoke and fire with which they are confronted, to identify with a scene of suffering that, quote unquote, we, the Western consumer subject, who is the presumed audience of the image, are said to have enabled through overconsumption. A pessimistic reading of this image might relate its visual strategies, the full frontal shot of a Black African child in a polluted landscape, to practices of colonial ethnographic photography. Or perhaps we might relate it to a more generic mode of war and humanitarian photography, which, at best, aims to evoke fellow feeling between spectator and subject, and at worst, extracts value from suffering. Indeed, some of Hugo's printed photographs have sold at auction houses for up to £30,000 each. A more generous reading of this image might be that it asks the spectator to exercise what Ariella Azulay calls civil skill. That is, the practice of recognizing the injury experienced by the person in the photograph, who, in gazing out at the spectator, is, as much as the photographer operating the camera or the person looking at the image, the author of the image, and who, addressing the spectator with their gaze, compels them to take action to reduce, mitigate, or care for their injuries. Or, indeed, as in the case of the last image by Udriago, we might read this image as a way for the spectator to recognize how the exploitation and toxification of e-waste workers relate to ongoing histories of colonial extractivism. The problem, however, is that these images do not straightforwardly document the site or e-waste pollution. Despite their benevolent intentions, they are highly stylized images that do not support a broader critique of the structural and historical causes of e-waste pollution. Instead, they are often framed by alarmist environmentalist discourses that call for the immediate end to e-waste exports and burning, despite their many economic benefits for workers. Hugo and Udriago's photographs function as both art objects and as evidence, as well as being hung on gallery walls and printed in newspapers. They have been reproduced by advocacy groups, which hold them up as proof of indiscriminate e-waste dumping, failing to account either for the complexity of the e-waste conservation economy and using the rhetoric of hell to support spurious, unscientific claims about the nature and extent of e-waste dumping. In his research on the transboundary flows of e-waste, Josh Leporski has pointed out that dramatic imageries of and stories about Agbogbloshie have repeatedly been used to reinforce the false assertion that around 50 million tons of e-waste are sent to Agbogbloshie annually. Leporski has shown that the actual figure is much less than this. Similarly, Grace Akisi has demonstrated through her fieldwork that e-waste is not the dominant form of scrap metal recycling at Agbogbloshie, and that a more significant portion of discarded scrap metal on the site comes from used automotive parts and heavy industrial machinery. Ghanaian photographer and activist Muntaka Chisant has corroborated this observation, testifying that the e-waste burning zone makes up a relatively small portion of land use at Agbogbloshie, compared with areas dedicated to repairs and a fruit and vegetables market. In his practice, Chisant has been committed to documenting other forms of e-waste recycling on the site, emphasizing the role of workers as self-taught media technicians and conservators within a buoyant second-hand electronics market, So we have an image here from inside one such workshop storage zone in just off Agbogbloshie and Zongo Lane. And likewise, the anthropologist Peter Little has emphasized the rich social and cultural fabric at Agbogbloshie, pointing out that the site is not only home to e-waste burning practices, but also to a well-established, predominantly Muslim Dagomba community that view it as a refuge of sorts from their outsider status as migrants in Accra. Misrepresentations of the scale, nature, and origins of e-waste pollution matter because they impact how resources are allocated to researching and acting on Agbogbloshie. They are worlding practices that establish the boundaries of what is thinkable and therefore actionable through interventions, solutions, and systematic transformations that could reduce rather than redouble harm. Owing to the notoriety of Agbogbloshie, substantial research funding has been invested in measuring the effects of toxic exposures on workers. Data has been collected from air, soil, and water samples, as well as from blood, urine, and breast milk. Although, like humanist documentary photography, these studies have benevolent intentions, they subject the bodies of workers at Agbogbloshie to continual measuring and do little to link up their studies with a more systematic analysis of the causes of e-waste pollution, such as global trade imbalances or land relations that date back to the colonial period. Little describes these practices as bioinformatic extraction, reproducing the earlier extractive logics of colonial science and medicine. Interestingly, photography and bioinformatic extraction have been combined in the work of occupational epidemiologist Zoe Lascaris, who has used cameras as recording devices to support the accurate measurement of toxic inhalation exposures. And you see a demonstration from that study on the screen here. And I will show you another image also from that study in which cameras were attached to the bodies of workers and at 1 minute intervals images were captured and linked up to inhalation exposures measured through a device that was also worn by workers. I'm quite pessimistic about this study, but there were some saving graces, as it were, of the images that were produced from it. I wanted to point out this one in particular because it shows the presence of women at the site of Agbogbloshie as well, who are normally left out of narratives about e-waste pollution and exposures. And so I thought that was particularly significant to share with you. But practices such as Lascaris's demonstrate Max Liboiron's assertion that pollution is colonialism, but also that pollution science is colonialism, in the sense that the self-same extractive logic and colonial land relations that enable pollution to occur through the extraction of mineral resources and the dumping of wastes are also those which enable the pollution, the capturing of photographs and the measuring of pollution through access to human bodies, but also to animal bodies, water bodies, and bodies of soil. The demolition of Agbogbloshie was carried out under the direction of former Accra Minister Henry Kwati and the Accra Metropolitan Assembly, or the AMA, as part of his Let's Make Greater Accra Work policy, which aimed to relieve congestion and reduce air pollution in urban Accra. By his own admission, Kwati devised his policy in response to international pressure resulting from the mass circulation of photographs of the site and the harm that these images may do to Ghana's public image and its capacity to attract foreign investment dollars. Before demolition, the AMA made numerous attempts to reduce or eliminate the impact of e-waste burning by both repressive and consensual means. In 2015, after intense flooding in the Corley Lagoon, attributed by local media to e-waste pollution, the AMA demolished thousands of homes, leaving displaced residents to face the worst effects of the rainy season. In 2018, GIZ, the development arm of the German government, and Pure Earth, an international NGO, opened a facility to train workers in the clean recycling of plastic-coated wires. Because of a lack of worker engagement, the facility was left unused and eventually closed. The reason for that lack of worker engagement was primarily because financial yields from formal recycling were much lower than that from of informal recycling. Only a few months before the demolition, progress meetings between GIZ and the Ghanaian government took place regarding the project's next steps. Simultaneously, several months of negotiations took place between scrap workers and Kwati regarding their relocation to a site at Ajin Kotoku, a new market area on the outskirts of Accra. The Accra Scrap Dealers Association, which represents a lot of workers, claimed that it had not agreed to a relocation deal and that the demolition represented a forced eviction. On the day of the demolition itself, workers who resisted by evoking their land rights and obstructing bulldozers were shot at and beaten by police and military. Since the demolition of Agbogbloshie scrapyard, the site has been designated for development as a state-of-the-art hospital. Meanwhile, informal scrap metals and e-waste recycling activities have dispersed across the city, with most workers continuing to burn cable copper wires in the nearby informal settlement of Old Fadama. In other words, the demolition did little to eliminate informal e-waste recycling, but simply displaced it. In some cases, e-waste burning now takes place indoors, heightening the risk of workers to toxic exposure. Geographers Richard Grant, Martin Oteng Ababio, and Michael Shin have pointed out that the demolition of Agbogbloshie parallels how colonial and post-colonial authorities weaponize aesthetics, hygiene, morality, security, and other socioeconomic concerns to legitimate their demolition and development of sites they deem undesirable. In her authoritative account of urban development in colonial Accra, Jennifer Hart has consolidated this link, identifying how the demolition of Agbogbloshie in many ways mirrors the emergence of technocratic discourses of urban planning and regulation in the early 20th century that enabled British colonial officials to reframe indigenous notions of spatial organization and governance in Accra as problems, which, they argue, posed threats to public health and welfare and inhibited economic growth. Hart explained that under colonial rule, the introduction of European urban planning principles privileged expatriate capitalism and carved out space for city elites, reorganizing the infrastructure, residential patterns, social dynamics, and economic processes around the demands of the colonialist capitalist city. These photographs of indigenous urban housing in the quote-unquote native town of colonial Accra, an area that roughly encompasses modern-day Jamestown, Ushertown, and Agbogbloshie, were taken from a sanitation report published by W.J. Simpson, who was a colonial medical professional in the early 20th century. This report is now held in the Colonial Office Archives in London, but also in the Public Records and Administrative Department in Accra. In this report, colonial anxieties about informal settlement and disease are apparent. Far from being sealed off as a repository of the colonial past, the Colonial Photographic Archive is crucial for understanding how sanitation and urban development policies in colonial Accra were cultural practices as much as they were technological or scientific ones, figuring as part of a broader, quote-unquote, civilizing mission to control disease, regulate native uses of urban space, modernize infrastructure, and maximize economic efficiency in ways that resound with the present-day situation at Agbogbloshie. In this report, Simpson wrote that houses, and I quote, houses in the native town are generally of the most primitive type, which in itself need not be unhealthy if regulated, end quote. He identifies a few key features of these houses, namely their quote-unquote irregularity, the narrowness of their entrance passages, the dilapidated condition of many homes, and their primitive and unregulated structure. I have to emphasize that those are Simpson's words in his report. Specifically, he points to the use of corrugated iron roofs held in place by large stones, which we can see in this image, as particularly problematic for their, quote, defective ventilation and insanitary condition, end quote. So yeah, as I said, this photograph shows a kind of colonial photographic documentation of indigenous urban housing. In the caption below the image, Simpson writes, it's probably very difficult to see there, but Simpson writes that, quote, nothing but demolition of huts and remodeling of the whole area can render it healthy, end quote. Here we can see a kind of more street level view, reflecting some of which Simpson describes in terms of how closely built up the houses are and their narrow walkways and small courtyard areas. In the caption to this image, Simpson describes the area as being, quote, built without regularity or order, end quote, recommending that it should be rebuilt in line with sanitation ordinances and town plans produced by the colonial government. Although photography is called upon here as evidence, these images cannot be taken as a direct index, that is, as proof of the unsanitary conditions that Simpson describes. At various points in his description, Simpson reaches beyond the supposed impartiality of scientific investigation to project his aesthetic judgments about indigenous housing. At one point in his report, Simpson likens the houses in this area to, quote, that formed if a cartload of bricks were overturned so that each brick was on the ground, end quote. Evidently, Simpson wanted to demolish and develop indigenous housing for aesthetic as well as epidemiological reasons. His normative perceptions of how housing should look, along with his fixation on regularity and order, were brought to bear on his scientific conclusions and policy recommendations. Okay, so much of colonial discourse on sanitation centered on the Corley Lagoon, which, since Accra was designated as the colonial capital of the Gold Coast, has threatened the colonial urban imaginary of Accra as the model colonialist capitalist city. Before colonization, Corley provided water, fish, and salt to Gar fishing communities for hundreds of years. According to oral traditions, it is home to an eponymously named goddess, a water spirit, who is the guardian of the waters of the lagoon, and in the local pantheon of deities, a moral force in the city. A, quote, haughty spirit, remote from the petty rivalries of humans, as suggested by her slogan, Na Kole on Mareko, or Elder Woman Corley, you will see me walking away aloof and above everyone, end quote. For colonists, by contrast, the lagoon was a quote-unquote native reservoir of disease due to the abundance of malaria-carrying mosquitoes and its tendency to flood. In 1927, the colonial government recommended that the land around the lagoon be acquired from indigenous Gar so that it could be deepened through the excavation of silt from beneath its waters and the subsequent use of the silt to fill in the lagoon's banks, limiting flooding and enabling construction. And the image on the screen is just a page from the report that is held in the Colonial Office archives, which identify Agbogbloshie specifically as an area for development as early as 1927. So I probably should have pulled the quote out of that, but you might be able to spot where it is. The drainage scheme was resumed in 1942. During the Second World War, when American and European soldiers were stationed in Accra, Lieutenant C.R. Ribbons of the Malaria Field Laboratory was assigned to rid the lagoon of malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Several measures were taken, including the forced enlistment of indigenous workers in experiments aimed at capturing and measuring the number of mosquitoes at the lagoon and using chemical pesticides such as DDT to sanitize the area. Following decolonization in 1957, Kwame Nkrumah's government acquired the land tenure rights to Corley and the surrounding area, So I'll just show you the lagoon itself as it exists today. Nkrumah quickly designated the site as a green wedge for conservation and protection amidst plans for rapid urban development in the city. However, following the geopolitical isolation of Nkrumah's government and the need for economic growth independent of the capitalist bloc, the area was eventually designated as a site for industrial development, housing factories to produce beer, cars, and other consumer goods. Well before the emergence of e-waste pollution, toxic pollutants from these industries acted on the Corley Lagoon ecosystem. By unfolding these events, I want to argue that e-waste pollution is part of a prolonged association of the lagoon with dangerous diseases and toxicants, and that a close historical analysis of the land history of the Corley Lagoon goes a long way to explaining why this ecosystem was sacrificed as an acceptable site of pollution as opposed to other areas of the city. The AMA has recently attempted to restore the Corley Lagoon through what they call the Corley Lagoon Ecological Restoration Project, or CLERP. Much like in the colonial period, these plans involve dredging the lake and clearing it of solid waste refuse, including e-waste. Interestingly, CLERP is not oriented toward restoring the lagoon to a state of imagined pre-pollution purity, or to a rewilding that restores biodiversity and respects the site's significance to Gar cosmology. Instead, it is oriented toward a neoliberal urban development project, quite far from conservation or restoration as commonly understood. Here we can see leaked CLERP development plans, which include eco-homes, state-of-the-art public transport, leisure activities, and sports facilities. These images indicate the AMA's current agenda for a quote-unquote new Accra that, in addition to the redevelopment of Agbogbloshie, also has the demolition of and redevelopment of Jamestown in its sights. In Jamestown, some indigenous Gar housing of the type documented by Simpson still stands, demonstrating the continued resistance of some Accra residents to the century-long colonial and now neo-colonial attempt to reshape the city according to transplanted European urban imaginaries. This new Accra is in contrast to the techno-pessimism of Hugo and Udriago, firmly techno-optimist. Not dissimilar to urban regeneration projects in European cities, it promises the construction of new quote-unquote communities through luxury property developments aimed at wealthy diaspora, expats, and foreign investors, leaving no trace of either Gar heritage or indeed of the Dagomba workers who have long occupied the land around the Corley Lagoon. So, as we've established across this conference, there are few hard and fast boundaries between the objects of nature and culture conservation. I hope that my talk has extended that in relation to techniques and technology. Yesterday, Lotte Arndt posed the concept of chemical modernity to think about histories of colonial geography, medicine, and sanitation, and to relate those practices to contemporary realities of toxicity. In my research, I use a parallel concept posed by Peter Little and Grace Akisi of toxic heritage or techno-precarious heritage to describe the multiple disasters of pollution, plunder, urban erasure, and green gone wrong interventions that act on Agbogbloshie, attempting to think what lessons can be learned both from the recent demolition and from the colonial archive about how environmental crisis zones are represented, researched, and governed. Many of these provocations put forward in this paper are not new. There is a growing literature in discard studies that has recognized the harm done at Agbogbloshie due to sensationalist media reporting and myopic academic research. Nonetheless, they are worth restating, particularly in a forum like this, where we're asking one another to think about conservation and care in an expanded way, to take it out of the museum, national parks, and conservation areas, and into the scrapyard. Thank you.
So happy birthday to you. So we'll take 5 minutes if our guests. Please maybe closer to me. Meet you halfway.
Yeah, congratulations to your birthday, but also especially for this or to this really fantastic paper and your thorough research. So I was thinking about, you were talking about the kind of imperial history of photography, and you were also referring to the inherent the camera. The inherent extractivism of digital photography, especially. And I was wondering, maybe it's more like a methodological question about your own choice and selection of photographs, of images, and how you constitute your own body of research through these photographs. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that question. And it's a really good one because here I've shown the most optimistic images I possibly could. There have been recent exhibitions and a lot of work done since these projects by Hugo and Udriago to document the site in different ways, particularly in visual anthropology. So Peter Little, the anthropologist I referred to several times, has conducted participatory photography workshops with workers to document their own circumstances. There's also been numerous photo voice studies doing similar, which I'm skeptical of for similar reasons that I was skeptical of Lascaris's project around bioinformatic extraction. The work of Muntaka Chasant, who I showed very, very briefly, unfortunately, is incredibly important in terms of advocating on behalf of workers and attempting to do that in the kind of international sphere of the art world and media. He, along with several other journalists, had a recent exhibition in Arles for the photography biennial there, which was a rather more kind of exhaustive study of this land history and of these causes of e-waste pollution in a similar way that I've presented it to you today. And so in my project, I am attempting to emphasize those practices as much as I can also. I also wanted to show you, there's two images that I didn't get to show you, and these are works by Edward Batinsky, who visited Agbogbloshie scrapyard and recently produced an augmented reality work, which he displayed in Venice, by taking 35,000 photographs of objects at the site and converting them into these kind of computer-generated images. And I'm equally skeptical about these practices, as you can imagine, but it's a very curious thing to see the objects reproduced in the gallery space, particularly thinking about this question of techno-optimism versus techno-pessimism also. But that's another talk and another chapter, I think. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. And thank you for the great question. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'll give you the floor in a second, but I just follow up for clarification because it's aligned. So did I understand well that you never showed your own photograph? So you don't photograph yourself? So you don't propose any alternatives?
I foreground the work of photographers.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think mine is related too. I was reminded of the archaeology of listening in a previous talk, which is different, of course, from capturing someone's image. And I was wondering if you could see that also as a way forward for maybe, yeah, going through this community there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a lot of existing anthropological research that works very closely with the community at Agbogbloshie. The political situation is very tense. During my fieldwork, it was difficult to gain access to workers or to union officials. And I think there are great people doing advocacy work on behalf of workers. My project focuses more on the circulation of these images in media representation, because partially because of my own positionality, also because I feel like it's perhaps a more important critique to be made in terms of how these images are circulated, looked at, commodified, objectified, and so on and so forth. I think that in future research, I would certainly like to incorporate closer working with the community and with workers there in Accra. It's quite difficult as a PhD project also to obtain ethical approval and such like for these things, but it's absolutely something that I think is crucial work that has been done to a large extent, particularly by Peter Little. And so I feel that my contribution to this field is most important and helpful in this critique of kind of media representation and the circulation of images. I take a lot of inspiration from somebody like Alan Sekula, for example, in that way. You know, that's kind of the sphere that my research is operating in at present. Yeah.
Thank you, Emily, for the introduction. I will just start right away. So I wanted to say firstly that it's kind of a blessing and a curse to be the last to present. Of course, we still have the rest of the afternoon to look forward to. On the one hand, I've had the opportunity to rethink some of the things I want to say, or more importantly, how I want to say them. And on the other hand, I'm now kind of second guessing every word that I've used. So if I don't really say anything about the new conservation object, it's because I'm now thinking about what I actually mean by that. Yeah. So I think we would all agree that what has become all the clearer over the past few days is the critical importance of positioning oneself in these very complex, multi-layered and ambitious discourses, and also being precise about what's at stake in our own projects. So with the benefit of some hindsight, I want to start in this way by laying my position out quite forwardly. It's also quite a daunting task after this morning's presentations, but yeah, so my training is mostly as an art historian, so I haven't been a conservation professional or a museum professional. Really, I'm very indebted to Hanna, who isn't here, or has disappeared briefly, for introducing me to the world of conservation and conservation theories more precisely, and as well as to questions about material culture more broadly when I was a master's student. So as someone who's then trying generally to think critically and mainly theoretically about conservation from an art historical perspective, I would place myself in what is being called the expanded field of conservation, which I kind of understand personally as conservation that kind of happens at the intersection of various disciplines. So this isn't for the sake of expanding just for the sake of expanding, but I understand it as kind of move towards a critical methodology for interrogating what conservation is and what conservation means. Of course, that isn't to say that conservation professionals don't critically reflect on their own practice, but just that it's crucial to acknowledge that what different disciplinary starting points afford and how they are, it's what's possible is different in different spaces. So when I think about what nature culture conservation means, or what nature culture conservation might look like, what immediately springs to mind is how art conservation, especially as it is generally understood in the Western canon, might be thought of in ways that are aligned with what are generally considered as forces of nature working on artworks. So most obviously processes of decay and degradation. I'm not trying to suggest that conservation theory has always been antithetical to these natural forces, but nevertheless, I think it's still safe to say that there's generally still this prevailing sense that this is generally still the prevailing sense of conservation, and although this has been changing over the past few decades, and I want to think through some of these changes with you later on. The reason why I'm interested in aligning conservation with decay and degradation is largely because of the kind of artworks that I'm engaged with as part of the Activating Fluxus Research Project. For those of you that are familiar with Fluxus or Fluxus adjacent artworks, you probably already sense a link between the kind of works that come to mind when one thinks of Fluxus and what I think is a necessity of thinking conservation and decay in somewhat complementary terms. But to recap, and for those of you less familiar with the world of Fluxus or Fluxus adjacent practices, in what follows, I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of Fluxus's emergence in the early 1960s, with a particular focus on how the category of the art object is being rethought at this time. And then I move on more specifically to the kind of object that I'm interested in at the moment, which is the phenomenon of the art's multiple, and also its relation to the process of multiplication as conceived by Swiss-Romanian artist Daniel Sperry and his project of the edition MAT, MAT standing for, in English, the multiplication of transformable art. What I kind of want to suggest is that in Sperry's conceptualizing of multiples and multiplication, he, in a very striking way, complements a lot of the theorizing in and around the notion of the conservation object in contemporary discourses of conservation, and at different points throughout the presentation, mostly towards the end, I'm very much drawing on material from these volumes. Sperry manifests some what I want to call an object complicity, which is adapting what Petra Langbert in her introduction to this volume on materiality calls material complicity. So under the rubric of material complicity, she asks, quote, "What does it mean to give agency to the material, to follow the material, and to act with the material," unquote. So for me, this idea of again, adapting material complicity to object complicity is a way to focus on the very specific relation, perhaps even power relation between the artist and the object and or their materials, as well as the conservator and the object and or the materials. But also going beyond the object or material, ultimately, the question I want to pose is, what would it mean to be complicit with matter as the elemental stuff of things? And is a kind of complicity with matter a way to imagine conservation as aligned with decay and degradation that inhabits not just what Sperry would call transformable, or he also calls them animate works of art, but also those more traditionally considered static. So I want to take us back to, or presence, the time of the 1960s, mostly in Europe and America, which more or less contemporaneously sees the emergence of artistic phenomena that, with great impetus, are palpably prone to transform in a variety of ways, degrees and intensities, phenomena such as performances, happenings, events, installation art, conceptual art, the use of so-called modern materials, food-based works, and works that move in various ways, whether through optical illusion, participant interaction, or are motorized in and of themselves, and so considered kinetic. Some of these tendencies famously get described by Lucy Lippard and John Tandler in their notorious 1967 essay, The Dematerialization of the Art Object. At least in their essay, what they kind of mean by dematerialization of the object is that there seems to be a shift in a kind of ultra-conceptual art wherein the object might become wholly obsolete, a meaning which has rightly been criticized. And as you can see from the slide, I mean, I've drawn from a selection of various Fluxus works in particular. The 1960s left behind a very dense material legacy, not all of which are artworks, but also in various other physical traces like ephemera. And nevertheless, that they go so far as to describe the art object as becoming dematerialized. I think this captures something of the zeitgeist of how this period understands itself in relation to the object, or the art object as one of a changing relation. which is characterized by a certain mutability and open to transformation beyond the artist's own intentions. And also at times the art object appears in quite ambiguous or ambivalent relation to the work of art itself. So the general Fluxus approach to the object is mainly mediated by the very eccentric figure of George Maciunas. Whether this should be the case or not is another discussion entirely, but he's the one mainly responsible for putting together very canonical Fluxus things, so things like flux kits and flux boxes, a few of which you see here. Most of the time it is Maciunas assembling these objects. He understands them as quite collaborative endeavors. So in theory, an artist comes to him with an idea and he materially realizes this, but in practice, sometimes he's just making these objects and attributing them to artists without them knowing that he's done this. He's mostly assembling these objects and attempting to sell these from his flux shop, which is located at 359 Canal Street, New York, which he sets up in 1964. Here you see the very blurry figures of Maciunas, but also Sperry, Dick Higgins, Alison Knowles, Io, and Letty Eisenhower in front of the Canal Street shop. It's just a staged photograph used to advertise the flux shop, which is ultimately a kind of comically unsuccessful enterprise in commercial terms, and barely anything gets sold. But for me, it's the most interesting thing is about this whole setup is how Maciunas understands what it is these objects do. So, for example, he writes in a letter to Fluxus affiliate Thomas Schmidt in January of 1964, quote, "Fluxus is definitely against art object as non-functional commodity to be sold and to make livelihood for an artist. It could temporarily have the pedagogical function of teaching people the needlessness of art, including the eventual needlessness of itself," unquote. So the temporary dimension of the object is something that's quite evident in the way some of these things are made and also how they're supposed to be interacted with. So in a point of comparison or contrast to Maria-Line's presentation yesterday, these things were not necessarily made to last, at least in a singular, enduring material form. And that's also exacerbated by, as you can probably tell by looking at some of these works, that they're supposed to be engaged with in quite an intimate or multisensorial way. So not just to be looked at, but maybe felt and smelt. The former curator of the Jean Brown collection at the Getty sums up the problems Fluxus how Fluxus challenges conventional conservation practices quite well when she writes of the 20th century avant-garde and of Fluxus in particular. That, quotes, "They warp, wrinkle, leak, ooze, or explode as they age. These artworks were created to be in an extended state of process. It is a given that they will deteriorate and maybe completely disappear. Most significantly, they're made to be experienced and handled rather than entombed like untouchable treasures in cases." So what you can see on the screen is an example of this leaking, oozing, and exploding of a sardine can that was in Fluxus artist Ben Patterson's Hooked, that Reed speaks a little bit about in her article. Yeah, and for clarification, this is a work that Patterson assembled himself, so in 1980, so not made by Maciunas. Arga actually also spoke with the conservator involved with the aftermath of this explosion, Albert Skamlek, who was here with us on Monday. But you can find this episode on our Activating Fluxus website. But to give a kind of short snippet, the sardine can was found to have exploded when a few decades after the object entered into the collection, a researcher called Patterson's Hooked outfit from storage and opened the box, and the smell infiltrated the room. The smell of the rotting sardines. I also wanted to show you some other example of things, maybe outside of the canonized Fluxus aesthetic, but that we've kind of encountered along the way. One of my favorite places we visited as a group is the storage spaces of the Archivo Konz in Berlin, which houses the private collection of Francesco Konz. And some of their staff had very interesting stories about a wide-scale insect infestation with, and I'm quoting them, one of them here, just about every variety of museum pest imaginable, unquote. They mentioned that the woodworm was particularly active, but also several species of moth, carpet beetle, silverfish, and biscuit beetle. And as you can see from some of these images, they really dramatically affected some of the objects. So when Lotte Arndt yesterday was showing, especially one of the one photograph of butterflies that were presented in very, what I guess was a typical entomological fashion, very neatly ordered and pinned to a board. I was immediately thinking of this photograph in the back of my mind, which is attributed to an artist called Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And it's just a box of dried spaghetti that's framed, but somehow a few insects got in and lay their larvae in the food source, who then grew and lay their own larvae in the food source. But a lot of the adult insects didn't manage to escape from the frame. So there's just bodies of the larvae and also the insects and their feces too, that's just kind of piled up at the edges here. Continuing on this subject of artworks getting eaten, another interesting example comes from Sperry himself, who in the late 1950s and early 1960s starts creating what are called trap pictures, which snare pictures or trap pictures, which very quickly become artworks that he is very well known for. These snare pictures tend to comprise the leftover remnants of chance-derived food-based situations, like half-eaten loaves of bread, fish bones, dirty plates and cutlery, stained napkins, cigarette butts and the like, and they're fastened by glue to their found surfaces. In 1961, the gallerist Arturo Schwartz, who owns the Galleria Schwartz in Milan, purchases a few of these snare pictures after Sperry has an exhibition there. And only a few months later, he writes to Sperry telling him that some rats had entered into the gallery's storage space and had eaten some of the organic elements of the snare pictures. And you see a before and after over here. In the letter, Schwartz requests that Sperry comes to Milan to fix his works, and enclosed in the letter, there's already a check for his expenses, but eventually Sperry refuses, and he kind of explains his reasoning in what become several important publications of his. So I took these images from one publication, which is his autobiography, which first published in German in 2001, and the quote comes from a much earlier artist book called The Anecdote Topography of Chance, which is first published in French in 1962. And it's a collaboration between Sperry and several of his friends. But he writes on the snare pictures that, quote, working with chance situations implies the acceptance of chance as a collaborator after the initial results have been achieved, of transformations due to time, weather, corrosion, dirt, etc. Example, the rats who devoured the organic matter on two of my snare pictures at Galleria Schwartz in Milan have been accepted as collaborators, end quote. There's also a footnote to Sperry's story that I thought was worth mentioning that's added to the English version of the Anecdote Topography that gets published slightly later. It's edited by Emmett Williams, but the footnote comes from Robert Filiu, who writes of what he also refers to as the collaborating rats that they, quote, to some extent, sorry, I'm missing a word there, to some extent, oh no, I'm not, that the collaborating rats contributed to some extent to the utility value of the snare pictures. At least these works of art were not simply gathering dust, the fate of so many paintings stacked in the storage annexes of museums and galleries. So I'm now shifting to Sperry's edition Matt, which I think offers a way to think through, to think through conservation in an expanded sense through his process of multiplication. And eventually I'll come back to this question of how we might be able to think of conservation as somehow aligned with decay. So when Sperry's edition Mat emerges in November 1959, inaugurated by a public presentation at the Gallery Edward Loeb in Paris, it was the first attempt of its kind to build something of a concrete infrastructure around the multiples production and dissemination. So what a multiple is exactly is sort of up for debate. Some critics, both contemporary and later, suggest that actually in principle all art has been multipliable. I'm choosing to work with the ambiguity of what a multiple is and maybe add kind of a critical dimension to this ambiguity too. Generally, when the term multiple is invoked, we're speaking about a phenomenon that really takes off in the 1960s. That are three-dimensional objects cheaply made and sold in high but limited numbers, or at least in theory in unlimited numbers. So it gets invoked. The multiple gets spoken of in this context of the 1960s, mostly because that's when the term is really getting popularized by artists, critics, galleries, and museums. And because it gets invoked in this context, it's also kind of historicized and theorized as a response to a particular stimulus of post-war unprecedented mass consumption and material production, as well as a response to the commodity status of the unique work of art. There's a fair bit of writing on this angle of the multiple, which is why I'm not going to necessarily address this side of things today. Yeah. So the artworks behind me are some of the works that feature when the edition Mat first emerges. The unifying thematic of this collection is the question of movement, whether movement manifests actually or conceptually. So this includes works by the likes of many of the usual suspects of the avant-garde, so Jean Tinguely, Marcel Duchamp, and Dieter Roth, who still at this time is a relatively unknown talent. I won't be talking about any of these artworks particularly, but just to give you a sense of generally what's going on behind the scenes. And in many ways, it kind of anticipates Maciunis's flux shop that I spoke about earlier. It's Sperry who's assembling these multiples when he can, and all of the works were priced at an equivalent to 200 Deutsche Marks, and at least in principle to be sold in editions of 100. A kind of interesting further aside too is that Sperry actually sends labels to the artists for them to sign, so he's the one physically sticking the labels onto the assembled works himself. And he doesn't always have enough of these labels, however. So in the Archives, which holds a lot of the correspondence for the edition Mat, there's a few letters expressing annoyance at Sperry for the fact that he hadn't yet stuck the labels on or sent the labels to them for them to stick on themselves. To give you some more background about Sperry's edition Mat, he's very drawn to practices that retroactively get called kinetic art. So an important event in the run-up to edition Mat's emergence is the 1955 exhibition Le Mouvement at the Galerie Denis René in Paris, which brings together, or attempts to bring together, multi-generational, generally European approaches to art that moves, which in the context of this exhibition is very much art that moves. It has the same meanings as generally what Sperry means by art that moves. So as I alluded to earlier, art that moves generally conceptually or actually, or also through optical illusions, artworks that require some form of participation, elements of artworks that transform in a way that can be rearranged by the participant, and also artworks that transform through themselves through motorization. There's a lot of overlap in personnel between artists that exhibit at Le Mouvement and that Sperry asked to contribute to the edition Mat. So again, there's Vasarely, Duchamp, and Tinguely. Vasarely is one of the co-curators of Le Mouvement, together with Denis René, and alongside the exhibition, and the exhibition's accompanying catalogue. He also writes and publishes something that gets nicknamed the Yellow Manifesto because of the paper that it's printed on. And in it, he says several things, sometimes in kind of jargonistic way, but the most important takeaway for me and perhaps for us is I think that he begins to suggest that, or he begins to kind of think through what it might mean to consider all art as kinetic, and his idea of kineticism is quite tied to the idea that artists should be actively somehow engaging movement or actively incorporating movement into their work, because this in part allows for an effacement of the artist's touch, and then in turn allows for what he envisions as a very like a mass distribution of all artworks. Yeah, through modes of, as he puts it here, recreation, multiplication, and expansion. So the quote that you see here actually appears in the first catalogue of the edition mat, but what's interesting is when it gets reprinted for Sprary, where you read the words plastic work gets substituted for conservation. So the quote reads, I didn't adjust the quote, but the quote reads, if the idea of conservation resided until now in an artisanal approach and in the myth of the unique piece, it is today found in the conception of the possibility of recreation, multiplication, and expansion. Yeah. So I'm wondering what it means for Vasarely to invoke the idea of conservation within the context of the edition mat, which allows us to pick up more specifically on the idea of the multiple and its relation to multiplication, because this is ultimately what Sprary himself picks up on. Sprary has a very clear idea about what makes a multiple a multiple. For him, it's artworks that are conceptualized through movement, hence the theme of the first collection. He writes in the opening of the edition mat catalogue that, quote, the static objective work permits only quantitative multiplication of the fixed idea present within the model. Even if it was widely disseminated, multiplication would not add anything to it. For the animated work, either by itself or through the interaction of the viewer-collaborator, multiplication renders justice to the infinite possibilities of transformation. I think here is a good example of what I referred to at the beginning of this presentation as a kind of object complicity. And through this complicity, he's trying to carve out multiplication as something distinct from prior modes of artistic reproduction. For him, multiplication is really something that attends to the specificity of the artwork at hand. So it's not just a process that can be foisted onto any work, but it's also a possibility that emanates from the artwork itself. Very soon after the edition mat catalogue is first published, he elaborates more so on this position in the Munich-based student journal Nota, where he also suggests, contrary to his prior indications of the multiples limited run, that maybe multiplication can be considered as a more perpetually open-ended process. So quoting Sprary again, he writes that as soon as an image is in change, whether due to actual or merely apparent motion, it enters into an ongoing state of transformation, making it endlessly new and different. Because it is created through movement, multiplication can happen at any moment, as it is always changing and renewing itself over time, unquote. The concept of time also got brought up yesterday by Anna, and it's obviously very relevant to Sprary's thinking here as well. What this excerpt makes clear for me is that for Sprary, artworks that move in space also are artworks that move in time. So artworks that engage movement in what he says as in an ongoing state of transformation, and so endlessly new and different are artworks temporally conceived. So as artworks transform, they become multiple in themselves because they generate new states in and of themselves. Where multiplication fits into this picture then is that for Sprary, to multiply a work is to express transformation that already is in a work. So to put it simply, what I think Sprary is saying is that to multiply is just another way of the multiple to move in space and in time. And this idea of multiplication is really not a stretch from how conservation is being thought of now as this kind of spatial temporal presencing of an artwork, which I think Anna was getting at yesterday. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah. So to work towards the conclusion, I want to come back now to the distinction that Sperry drew earlier between animated and static works, and whether or not we can begin to complicate these boundaries, and in doing so, push Sperry's thinking on multiples and multiplication further, particularly thinking about what constitutes a multiple, and in turn what might be multiplied. To do this, I'm going to address some contemporary conservation theory, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, it's rethinking of what the conservation object is. I didn't really know how to visualize this, so I've just tried to collect some key terms on the screen drawn from these various publications. So the notion of the conservation object is first introduced into conservation discourse by Salvador Muñoz Viñas in his contemporary theory of art conservation. I think, to put it simply, what he describes as a conservation object is something of a construct that emerges in the late 19th century, which is often the historical starting point for the canonical Western sense of conservation. I was initially going to sketch out more of the kind of wider intellectual material conditions that are materializing in this period of time, but I think it's also sort of been covered in other presentations already. I mean, it's very much a time of enlightened modernity. For some scholars, it's when these dualisms we've kind of inherited today get cemented as dominant ways of thinking in the West. So dualisms between nature and culture, subject and object, human and non-human, mind and matter, which also are part of the framework of empire. So conservation, especially cultural conservation, emerges in this period as a science, and the conservation object is an object of scientific investigation. That's opposed to, known through science as opposed to non-scientific means. Non-scientific as in the artisan craftsmanship of restorers, everyday acts of mending and maintaining, and also in a time of colonial collecting, obviously also non-Western practices of care that are indigenous to the lands that some objects are being taken from. Ultimately, for Muñoz Viñas, the conservation object is, on the one hand, the objects that conservators conserve, and on the other, it's also an object that legitimizes conservation as conservation. So what I think what is important to highlight is that conservation has always been a subject-object relation, and the kind of true complexity of what this relation is what's currently being rethought through this framework of the conservation object, especially in terms of where the locus of agency is beyond the scientific conserving subject. And this is also being thought in relation to the agency of subjects, communities that have a particular claim to particular objects, for example. I want to clarify that my interest is what it means to shift the agency to the object itself, though this is not always mutually exclusive with the agency of subjects outside of institutions. So what's been quite inspirational to my thinking is this notion of the agential object that has been introduced into the discourse by Hanna, and also built on by Hanna, Emily, and their other colleague, Jules, which they suggest might condition their own, which might dictate their own conditions of care. In another sense of rethinking the conservation object, I've also been very inspired by thinking about the object not as an object at all, but just as provisional gatherings of what, again, in conservation discourses has recently been called active matter. Peter Miller, in this context, introduces what he calls the quantum theory of the object, which I think is really useful in helping us challenge Sperry's boundaries between the animate and the static, and for building the case that all artworks, insofar that at a quantum level, they're all aggregates of active matter, move. Yeah, what I'm trying to do is think about how artworks move, not just in the sense of Sperry's drawing on kinetic art, animate art, kind of very obviously transformable art, but also perhaps in a way that, for example, an oil painting might decay in a flake, how that might exhibit a kind of kinesis in and of itself. To bring Sperry's multiple into more concrete dialogue with these contemporary understandings of the conservation object, and perhaps also trying to combine the notion of the agential object with active matter. I'm wondering if all at least matter-based artworks might be considered multiple and so lend themselves to multiplication. Both following and building on Sperry's thinking, as well as the state of current conservation discourses, I'm wondering if even the flaking oil painting might be understood as something that is animate, because as matter it is inherently always moving, and in turn could decay and degradation be aligned with conservation under the rubric of Sperry's multiplication, insofar that decay and multiplication become two different expressions of the same phenomenon, which is matter's capacity to transform. And perhaps what I've been calling Sperry's object complicity might lend itself to a complicity with matter and with what matter wants, or with matter's wanting to change. I will leave you with this image of a very, I think, potent expression of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josephine, for this very thought-provoking and dense presentation. I would be curious to see how this concept can maybe not translate, but transpire onto nature conservation ideas as well. I don't know who wants to start with questions for Josephine.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And also like putting it in your own words, like, yeah, let me reflect on my presentation again. One question, I mean, it's super important to think about like those fluxus objects, because they are practices in this context, or like, yeah, very helpful, because for me it's always really interesting to see what those institutions are doing to those kind of practices. And I remember that we met at the Archivio-Cons in Berlin, and I remember also like that, but this has already been some years ago, so perhaps they changed their practice, I don't know. But it was really like this Rubio objectification machine that they had on running, you know, like you had like a box full of cigarettes and like leftovers and waste and so on, and then every piece was carefully placed and photographed, and like that brings me back to the power, of course, of images and so on. So I was wondering what your thoughts about this like institutional practice is with regard to the artistic concept.
I think I want to start by, I don't know, I think because we spent some time, or maybe some more time really in the storage space, I had the opposite feeling, or maybe not that it was a complete objectification machine, but I think we were really sort of immersed with the staff there, so including the art handlers, and yeah, I think it's really interesting from the perspective of how we engage these collections. So like really being immersed in this kind of space with the art handlers, like for them, they're always, like they were saying, I mean, I hear this happens all the time, so I hope I'm not saying anything like strange, but that, you know, accidents happen all the time, and it kind of becomes part of what the object is. I don't know. We were allowed to kind of engage with these artworks in very intimate ways. And I don't know, we actually saw one of the same works exhibited in a museum, so kind of taken away from the storage space and into the gallery space where it was vitrinized. And I think it was I don't know, the Archivia concept, at least for me, was something that, I don't know, I had the opposite sensation. And then I actually saw the objectification machine kind of in full force with one of the artworks that we'd had kind of just like sitting there on the table. Yeah, but with your question is about how these institutional practices and artistic practices coincide and what happens then, or? Yeah, 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 yeah. No, I know. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I understand, I completely understand the angle that you're getting from. I kind of was thinking, I don't know, when I envision Spurry's multiplication, I don't know, I was thinking of it weirdly kind of very outside of the institution. I mean, at the time when these artists are making multiples, they are kind of having to go through the gallery system at some points because it's the only way that they can distribute the multiples. And I think there are some historians thinking about this as a kind of corporate mimicry that ultimately fails, kind of trying to infiltrate the gallery system. Yeah, anyways, it ultimately generally fails because these things are so expensive now. But I think that yeah, commodification is one thing, but I also think that it's, I don't know, for me, I wasn't thinking about the multiple as something to sell really, but as something, but with how it operates like as a conservation object. So yeah, I wasn't thinking of it as something to sell. I was more thinking of it in terms of, for example, if it's in a museum, possibly, how can you allow one, how can you allow it to decay and pass on, and then also, and then kind of make another one as something that is like complementary to this decay and passing on. So I wasn't thinking about it as something to sell now, but more as kind of like a model for expanded conservation. Yep.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering what your position on this question is. So at the heart of Fluxus is the performative nature, both you outlined here the materiality and matter, but also, of course, the performative nature of it being like effective towards the human, right? So I'm wondering, do you, like the objects that you are researching, would you say those are being conserved are still Fluxus by nature, or is this change or like quality once they become piece of conservation, um, and that actually
Thank you for that question. I mean, yeah, I think that it's difficult to not I think there's multiple layers to it. On the one hand, for example, like a lot of the objects, maybe you could make the case that they're no longer the artworks as the artists conceived of them, whether that's like rightly or wrongly we think in that way, but because the artwork tends to happen kind of in the event of an experience. So maybe what is in these collections, it's not necessarily the artworks themselves, although they're catalogued and categorized that way, but it's kind of a different kind of material legacy. So I don't know, they're still, I think, Fluxus objects, but are they necessarily, you know, the works of art? Then yeah, it's maybe a different question.